Chevreuse could be one of the best 4-stars to ever come out in Genshin. That's what I said in a video I made a few weeks ago. I think she truly has the potential to be a very good 4-star. In this video I will elaborate on that more while also providing sort of a guide. To summarize her kit a bit, she is a character that consolidates a couple different roles. Her main trait is supporting a very specific type of team that can be composed only by Pyro and Electro characters. If this primary condition is fulfilled, then the infamous overload reaction will gain the power to reduce resistance to both of these elements on the opponent's it hits for 6 seconds, which basically replaces the purpose of the very decent vanilla set on these teams. On top of that, if used after an overload reaction, her elemental skill will gain the property of buffing the whole team's attack by an amount that scales up depending on how much maximum HP Chevreuse has. Then, obviously, her constellations also enable other useful effects, like her Constellation 1, that makes the active character regain 6 energy after it triggers an overload reaction with a cooldown of 10 seconds. Her Constellation 6 makes her able to give Pyro and Electro damage bonuses to all the characters that receive her healing. Yes, she has healing. But we'll get to this later. For now, just know that she can provide damage bonuses that can amount even to 60% for the active character, and this is pretty great. Note that both this Constellation 6 and the passive that provides an attack buff for the whole team are not dependent on you having only Pyro and Electro characters on the team. So, theoretically, she's not just relegated to her niche, but for this video I just want to focus on that because in my opinion that's what makes her very interesting. In terms of supporting her niche, she is very good, because even at Constellation 0 she can compete with characters like Kazuha and Sucrose holding Trillium Tails here. And at Constellation 6 her multitude of buffs becomes too much to compete with even for a character like Kazuha, and that sounds a bit crazy to say, honestly. Of course, personal damage output and grouping capabilities are also things that make Kazuha great in his roles. It's not just about buffing the damage. And while Chevreuse can't quite replicate the dominance he has in AoE scenarios, she can hold her own in some ways. First, her single target damage output is actually not bad if you build for it, so if you give her offensive artifacts, a solid weapon, she can actually even surpass Kazuha in single target situations. Second, she also has some sort of crowd control, because both her burst and the Constellation 2 version of her elemental skill have an effect that when they hit opponents, they will pull them towards Chevreuse's position, and that's pretty nice. But most importantly, the one thing that could make Chevreuse stand out even compared to a character like Kazuha is about how she can apply her resistance reduction. The only requirement is triggering an overload reaction. She doesn't need to go on field. Meanwhile, the Anemo units like Kazuha need to go on field to swirl opponents and trigger the very decent vanilla effects, because it doesn't apply for off-field swirls. So, if for example you are in a multi-wave situation and you're using a carry like Raiden, Yoimiya, Klee that can't freely switch in and out, one thing that very typically happens is that you kill a wave but your rotation hasn't ended yet, so you proceed by attacking the second one. Since you can't switch out from your carry, you will not be able to reapply the resistance reduction effects with an Anemo unit, and that's a damage loss for the rotation. Meanwhile, since with Chevreuse it's only dependent on overload reactions, it's much more consistent in these scenarios, and that's great value. Moreover, the fact she doesn't need to go on field at all to enable these resistance reduction effects could enable some interesting possibilities, like you pulling off a very fast setup to dish out damage as fast as possible. This is very similar to Baiju's Constellation 2, which enables a playstyle for him where he doesn't even need to go on field to provide the Dendro application, and that's pretty nice because it saves rotation time and it's good for speedruns. Overall, while she doesn't have all the utility Kazuha has, she has a higher ceiling of buffing, and she also has other useful things that can come in handy that Kazuha lacks. And on top of this, she can also heal the team. It's HP scaling healing that comes from her elemental skill and will heal the active character every 2 seconds for 12 seconds in total. At Constellation 0, it's not bad. It's technically possible to solo sustain a team with it if you're careful, But at Constellation 6, that's where it gets very noticeable, because the Constellation 6 adds a team-wide healing effect at the end of the 12 seconds duration, and that's pretty nice. But honestly, it's not a big deal, because Bennett is a great unit for teams because of the attack buffs he provides, and since he also heals on top of that, you don't need that much healing from Chevreuse, in my opinion. Sure, it's not a given that you will bring Bennett, but there has not been a scenario where that's not been favorable in my early calculations, so I'm just assuming that for now. And again, there is value in building Chevreuse offensively for her damage output, so let's see that. First of all, her energy requirements. They can fluctuate between 160% and 200%, even on teams where you're pairing her with many pyro units or Raiden, because she doesn't generate a lot of particles per rotation. Her elemental skill just generates 4, and at Constellation 0 you will only be able to use that once a rotation, most of the time. Her Constellation 4 allows her to use the elemental skill multiple times a rotation, but the thing is, it has a cooldown in her particle generation. It can only generate particles every 10 seconds, so even if you use it multiple times, odds are you won't be able to generate more than 4 particles. In terms of weapons, there are a lot of options, the 5-star ones being the best picks, of course, if you want Chevreuse to do as much damage as possible, but she needs a lot of energy, so as a standard pick, Favonius makes sense. There are also options like Rightful Reward, the free-to-play weapon that came with Fontaine, that provide more energy for Chevreuse specifically than Favonius does, and also gives an HP percent secondary stat that helps with her passive and her healing. But I'm saying Favonius because since she is replacing Kazuha on teams, and Kazuha being a unit that is popularly used with a Favonius weapon because of how easy it is for him to proc the effect, Chevreuse replacing that role of fame on teams will be sensible. In terms of artifacts, if you want her to deal damage, there are a lot of options, because she doesn't have a very specific trait. Her damage is pretty evenly distributed between elemental skill and elemental burst, so she really has a lot of artifacts to pick from, just select the one that has the best substats for you. For artifact stats, an energy recharge or attack sense depending on the weapon you're using, and then a pyro goblet and a crit circlet, so the standard. On the other hand, if you want her to heal as much as possible, then just build her with HP percent pieces. Sets wise, artifacts like the Clam set or the Days Pass set become more useful because they're dependent on the character healing, but honestly they won't have much of an impact because their damage output is just low, so you can pick anything really, don't stress it. In terms of team building, I sure wonder what's going to end up on her teams, surely not Pyro and Electro units. A good rule of thumb is to not take it for granted that you will be able to proc overloads consistently on her teams, because you will need a good source of off-field application to do that. So if your on-field there is a pyro unit, you will need a good source of electro application off-field, for example Fischl, and conversely, if your on-field there is an electro unit, you will need a good source of pyro application off-field, so for example Xiangling. This team course composed by Chevreuse, Bennett, and one between Fischl and Xiangling are pretty strong because other than applying their element consistently, Fischl and Xiangling are also very good sub-DPS that benefit immensely from Chevreuse and Bennett. Starting from this basis, you can build very competitive teams with carries like Raiden, Klee, Yoimiya, and so on, any unit that can benefit from Chevreuse, so any Pyro and Electro unit basically. Teams that can compete and even surpass pretty comfortably the variants with Kazuha, while also providing the multi-wave advantages I've listed before, so it's pretty great. For other types of teams like the quick swappy teams with Fischl and Beidou, you don't really need that much off-field pyro application, because in those scenarios you can just swap in with Chevreuse or Bennett to reapply pyro and proc overload, so in that case you don't need to bring Xiangling, for example. Generally, you will need a Constellation 6 Chevreuse to overcome Kazuha completely on these teams, but this is a 4-star, so sadly her benefiting from Constellations massively is a given. But even at Constellation 0, she enables the construction of teams that as a baseline are very strong, and that's what makes her interesting to me, that's what makes her a very good 4-star to me. The thing that makes her stand out to me is her capability to enable a whole new niche in Genshin in a way we don't really see much. Because with Chevreuse, you're truly building teams around her, around this 4-star, and I don't think this happens a lot with the meta in Genshin. Even ignoring numbers and meta for a second, to me this makes her more similar to a 5-star in concept than to a 4-star, and this is very good. And with this, I'm done for today. Peace!